Can men and women ever achieve true equality if we continue to view gender as a battlefield? While the question may seem provocative, it's rooted in the reality of how public discourse around gender often plays out today. While gender equality has undoubtedly made significant strides over the years, we still seem to find ourselves in a constant cultural tug-of-war, with each side airing grievances they believe the other side either ignores or denies. While women worry that they continue to be disadvantaged in politics and the workplace by expectations that unfairly favor men, men worry about equal rights in family life and equal attention in areas ranging from mental health care to education. To make matters worse, as often as we're promised a world where gender differences will become less and less relevant, we nevertheless witness the perspectives of men and women growing further and further apart, with many media figures and pundits dubbing the 2024 US election as an electoral war of men against women. How did we get here? Before we dive into a topic that may feel a little unusual for this channel, I want to acknowledge something up front. I'm a man talking about gender relations. I know some may find that odd. After all, who am I to discuss the challenges and complexities of gender, especially when it comes to the experiences of women? It's a fair question. After all, regardless of what one might think about gender dynamics in present times, it's indisputably true that women have been politically, economically, culturally, and legally disadvantaged for millennia. I want to make clear that I do believe it's important to amplify the unique perspectives of women about their experiences of inequality, both past and present. That said, I fundamentally believe that this is an issue that affects all of us, men and women alike. We both have a duty to contribute positively to discourse on this issue as best we can. The way men and women relate to one another shapes the very fabric of our societies, impacting work, family life, politics, and community. True progress is not just a moral imperative for one group, but a foundational step towards a society that works for everyone. The stakes for all of us are too high not to engage with these conversations thoughtfully, openly, and respectfully, as each of us is able. That said, why is it so difficult for many of us, liberal or conservative, male or female, religious or secular, to imagine a world where men and women thrive together without animosity or mean-spirited competition? Even if we envision such a world, it often seems impossible to put into practice. For progressives, it seems like no matter how much feminists try to fight for the advancement of women, men resist attempts to disassemble the patriarchy because they feel threatened by women who hold power and feel compelled to cling to the privileges they've inherited as a result of systemic inequality. For conservatives, it seems like no matter how men try to supportively adapt to the new gender roles expected in the modern age, men are mocked, ridiculed, derided, and devalued regardless of what they do. It can leave many of us wondering, is it even possible to build a society where both men and women can be equal partners, free from the weight of history and the burden of resentment? Or are we doomed to remain locked in a cycle of blame and division, with each side trying to outdo the other, but never truly moving forward? Well, what if we took a step back? What if we re-examine the question at a more foundational level? What if, instead of viewing gender relations as a power struggle to be won or lost, we viewed gender relations as a respectful collaboration to co-create a better world, respecting the unique contributions of men and women alike, while emphasizing first and foremost the common human dignity we all share? Is such an approach even possible? Or is it simply a pipe dream that ignores the fundamental nature of reality or the deep-seated injustices that have manifested throughout the past? To answer that question, it pays to analyze where exactly we are. Gender relations, for better or worse, are issues grounded in stark reality. Issues that shape the lives of millions of men and women every day. For example, while women now make up the majority of university students and earn a higher percentage of college degrees, women continue to be underrepresented in leadership positions in the workplace and politics. This divide becomes especially pronounced when one realizes that, despite 58% of men expressing optimism that it's only a matter of time before there are an equal number of women in political office as men, only 46% of women believe the same. Despite the progress women have made, they still earn, on average, only 82 cents for every dollar a man earns in comparable positions. A figure that, even when nuanced by the fact that women are more likely to work part-time than men, nevertheless still highlights the reality that women are penalized in the workplace for having children, often receiving lower wages, fewer opportunities for advancement, and more pressure to balance home and work life than their male counterparts. Women are also unfortunately far more likely to be victims of domestic violence, with 1 in 4 women experiencing intimate partner violence during their lifetime. Meanwhile, men are disproportionately impacted by homicide, representing 77% of all victims. Men are 3.5 times more likely than women to die by suicide, and their life expectancy is nearly 5 times shorter than that of women. Boys are far more likely than girls to face harsher punishments in schools, and women are now outperforming men at every level of education. Women comprise 58% of all college students in 2020, and in 2022, women earn the majority of post-secondary degrees at every level, accounting for 62.8% of associate degrees, 58.5% of bachelor's degrees, 62.6% of master's degrees, and 57% of doctoral degrees. In 2023, while 65.3% of recent female high school graduates attended college, only 57.6% of male recent high school graduates did. In family life, according to the most recent US Census, mothers are granted sole or primary custody of a couple's children 79.9% of the time. This discrepancy is due to historical assumptions that men's contribution to parenting is predominantly financial rather than emotional, moral, or educational. Only 48% of men report feeling satisfied with friendships, and only 1 in 5 men say that they've received emotional support from a friend in the past week, compared to 4 in 10 women. And while women are massively overrepresented as victims of domestic violence, many male victims feel unable to get help because of deep, enduring stigma around the notion that a woman could ever abuse a man. To be clear, the causes of these issues are many and varied, so it can be overly simplistic to set these statistics side by side without any context. My intent is not to construct a narrative about these disparities based simply on a few data points, nor is it to pick sides to identify which sex seems to have things worse off. Rather, my intent is to highlight that the frustrations both sides feel is grounded in true, concrete realities people experience in their day-to-day lives, and they can't be dismissed purely as the product of propaganda. So, if data alone can't explain our contemporary struggles, what can? To truly understand how we got here, we need to look at the evolution of gender roles throughout Western history. Why is it necessary to look at history? Our current views on men and women are shaped by centuries of philosophical debates, cultural traditions, and socioeconomic development. Far from being irrelevant, examining this history helps us understand why gender roles have developed the way they have, and why they continue to shape our lives in the manners that they do. The ongoing tension between men and women is not just a product of contemporary politics, but the culmination of centuries of evolving thought about power, responsibility, and identity. Therefore, to truly comprehend why women continue to fight for equal representation, or why men increasingly feel disrespected or left behind by society, we need to understand the philosophical and cultural legacies that shaped, and in many ways still shape, our expectations of what it means to be a man or a woman. As we begin our historical reflection, there are three things that I would like you, the audience, to keep in mind. First, regardless of whether you're traditional or progressive, think about what you picture when you hear traditional gender roles. Is it the 1950s, the Victorian era, or something even older? As we explore the past, pay attention to where certain aspects of these roles may have originated. What you find may be surprising. Second, consider the difference between identifying a problem and solving it. Do the movements across history, whether revolutionary or reactionary, truly resolve the issues they attempt to address, or do they just shift them in another direction? Finally, regardless of where you stand on gender relations, consider the perspective of Simone de Beauvoir, who argued that women have historically been defined not by their own identity, but in relation to men, specifically by how they serve or exist for men. As we move through history, ask yourself, how does this idea hold up, and how might her notion of one sex being viewed as normative while the other is defined relatively possibly illuminate something about how gender roles continue to function today? We'll begin our analysis in ancient Greece. While stretching so far back into history may seem puzzling, the works of Greek and Roman philosophers laid the foundation for how Western thinkers would continue to understand men and women all the way until the early modern age. While it would be inaccurate to depict ancient Greece as a cultural or philosophical monolith, the civilization consisted of many independent city-states, for example. We can nevertheless identify dominant strains of thought amongst Greek thinkers that came to define later perceptions of classical views on gender, acting as the foundation of what would follow. Plato and Aristotle, rather than focusing on questions about the nature of masculinity or femininity outright, instead asked questions about human nature more universally, postulating only afterwards whether it was men or women that more perfectly modeled the ideal human. Perhaps unsurprisingly, both thinkers came to the conclusion that it was men who were naturally more capable of perfecting themselves. Well, according to the metaphysical systems devised by both Aristotle and Plato, activity is more perfect than passivity. Both thinkers ascribed activity to men and passivity to women due to their understanding of physical intercourse, wherein men were seen as the active agents while women were viewed as passive recipients. It's important to note, especially for those classical-minded philosophers like myself, who still take inspiration from the metaphysics of Plato and Aristotle, that even if you accept their overarching metaphysical framework, the reason for ascribing these features to men and women respectively was scientifically flawed. Modern biology has shown that both men and women are active agents in reproduction, with both contributing equally in their own ways. Consequently, we can't reason the way Plato and Aristotle did that activity is naturally characteristic of men and passivity naturally characteristic of women. That said, how did their metaphysical conclusions shape their views of men and women more generally? For Aristotle, this manifested in his belief that men were more rational and virtuous by nature, while women were viewed as defective versions of the human form, lacking the full capacity for reason and self-governance compared to their male counterparts. Plato, though more progressive in that he imagined a more egalitarian society in his Republic, where women could hold positions of leadership alongside men, nevertheless agreed with Aristotle that men were naturally more predisposed to reason and virtue than women. This philosophical backdrop shaped Greek society's gender norms, which often relegated women to subordinate roles in the public sphere. Men, in fact, were so culturally exalted over women that Greeks often placed a higher value on same-sex friendships, both platonic and non-platonic, than on male-female relationships. Such same-sex bonds were often viewed as more authentic and fulfilling, based upon the belief that men could share a deeper intellectual and emotional connection with each other than with women, who were typically seen as less intellectually or morally capable. This hierarchy of relationships set the stage for centuries of gendered thinking, influencing not just Greek culture, but the broader Western philosophical and social tradition that followed. How did these ideas evolve within ancient Roman society? While many Romans continued to believe, as the Greeks had, that men were naturally more capable of intellectual and moral perfection than women, they developed discourse on gender further, by examining how masculinity and femininity were specifically defined and embodied. Roman culture placed a high premium on masculinity, associating virtue with traditionally masculine traits such as bravery, strength, and leadership. In fact, the very word for virtue itself, virtus, was derived from the Latin word for man, vir, underscoring the belief that virtue was inherently a male attribute. Masculinity in this context was often defined in terms of dominance, dominating others in battle, in leadership, and in public life, while femininity was defined by submission. Although submission wasn't exclusively feminine, as men too were expected to submit to those in positions of authority, the submission of men to those deemed beneath them, especially women, was considered emasculating and humiliating. This idea is dramatically illustrated in the story of the martyrdom of Sergius and Bacchus, two Christian soldiers who were punished by being paraded through the streets of Rome dressed in women's clothing before their execution. In Roman thought, masculinity wasn't just the normative standard of human nature. It was defined as something distinct from femininity, inherently linked to power and dominance. Men were viewed as naturally suited to lead, while women were expected to follow. Not necessarily just because men were seen as more rational or virtuous, but also because Roman society believed that men were simply made to dominate, and this dominance was understood as a natural and essential aspect of their identity. As philosophers in the late classical period sought to synthesize Greek and Roman thought, many came to the consensus that the subjection of women to men was morally desirable, since those deemed less capable of governing themselves would benefit from the governance of someone for whom such leadership and self-governance came more naturally. Well, that's the ancient world. How did these ideas evolve as the West entered the Christian Middle Ages? The reality is nuanced. On the one hand, Christian theology emphasized a revolutionary idea for its time, that men and women were equal in their supernatural destiny, both called to salvation and moral perfection. God's grace, regardless of one's nature, enabled anyone to achieve the moral and spiritual perfection they were made for. This belief in spiritual equality led to the radical notion that, within the body of Christ, there was no distinction between male and female, as St. Paul stated in Galatians 3:28. Furthermore, not only were women encouraged to follow the example of early female martyrs and Mary Magdalene, who was the first witness of Christ's resurrection, but men and women alike were exhorted to emulate the virtues of Mary, who was held up as the example par excellence of Christian virtue, since she was the holiest person to have ever lived save Christ himself, who was God. On the other hand, the early Middle Ages inherited many of the gender assumptions of Greek and Roman thought, which naturally made their way into Christian discourse. Monastic writings, for example, often reflected a deep ambivalence towards women. While men and women were equally destined for salvation, figures like Jerome and Augustine portrayed women as morally and intellectually weaker, prone to distraction and vice. These views were often tied to scripture, citing stories such as the fall of man by the choice of Eve. Women were characterized as tempting men away from their spiritual goals, creating an environment where celibacy became highly valued, not only as a means to avoid worldly distractions and to focus on devotion to Christ, a pursuit promoted directly by Christ in the scriptures, but also as a way to protect men from the perceived negative influence of women. The tension between these views, the affirmation of women's equality in the divine order, and the suspicion of their moral and intellectual capacities, continued to play out through the rest of the Middle Ages, pitting egalitarianism against deeply entrenched social prejudices. Did these views change at all as the Middle Ages developed? Once again, the reality is nuanced. Scholasticism, which dominated later medieval thought, sought a logically consistent synthesis of Christian faith and natural philosophy. What did Thomas Aquinas, the most dominant figure in this tradition, think of men and women respectively? Aquinas' most significant contribution to the discussion of gender was his rejection of the notion that men and women had distinct masculine and feminine souls. Contrary to some of his predecessors who viewed masculinity and femininity as inherent qualities of the soul, Aquinas argued that, since the soul is the form of the body, and both men and women share the same human nature, to assert that there were separate souls for each gender would imply that men and women were different species, rather than equal members of the human race. For Aquinas, both men and women possessed one common humanity, sharing the same essential nature as human beings, with no inherent difference in their fundamental worth or supernatural destiny. In this respect, Aquinas' views on gender not only echoed the earlier medieval belief in the equality of men and women before God, as expressed in the New Testament, but also established a logical framework consistent with classical metaphysics that viewed men and women in a more equal light. However, while men and women were equal in their shared humanity, Aquinas did believe that masculinity and femininity were distinct and concrete realities. These realities, he reasoned, must be rooted in the body rather than the soul. According to Aquinas, masculinity and femininity emerged from the unique roles that each sex plays within the reproductive process. He believed that these physical differences, rather than being a source of competition between the sexes, were instead naturally complementary, both existing as part of God's perfect plan for nature. In this way, the body, through its biological roles, was thought to shape how the soul expressed itself. The soul, being proportioned to the body, would naturally reflect differences in personality and inclinations. Therefore, despite men and women sharing the same human nature, he reasoned that men and women naturally act differently, forming the basis for why men and women are assigned their respective roles in society. Here then we see how Aquinas sought to reconcile his belief in the equality of the sexes with classical gender roles. Aquinas, following Aristotle, believed that men were naturally more perfect than women, at least in terms of intellectual and moral development. Accordingly, while Aquinas did believe that God's grace could account for any natural inequality, Aquinas argued it was fitting for men to hold leadership roles in society, not because women were incapable of virtue or intellect, but because men were seen as better suited for such roles, particularly in political and public life. This hierarchical view of gender, which Aquinas supported with reference to scriptural passages such as Ephesians 5:21-23 or 2 Timothy 2:1-10, reinforced classical gender roles that placed men as leaders and women as supporters. Thus we arrive at the early modern era, a period famously characterized by critical examination of traditional thought. How did early modernity begin to reshape understandings of sex and gender? While Neoplatonic and Aristotelian views on gender still dominated Renaissance and Reformation thinking, the era also saw some of the first challenges to classical gender roles. Women like Christine de Pizan and Margaret Cavendish, both well-educated and intimately familiar with history and philosophy, questioned long-standing assumptions about women's intellectual and moral capabilities, appealing not just to personal experience, but also metaphysical arguments and historical examples of strong, morally capable women. They asked whether the subordinate position of women was truly a natural order, or whether it merely reflected a long-standing power structure entrenched by tradition and justified after the fact. In her famous work, The Book of the City of the Ladies, Christine de Pizan is guided in a vision by reason, righteousness, and justice to realize that women are not inherently evil, incapable of learning, or easily swayed. Rather, women, like men, are equally capable of moral perfection and intellectual development, given the same opportunities for education. A culturally significant example of a woman subverting gender norms was Joan of Arc, a young female visionary who led the French army in battle against the English, decisively altering the course of the 100 Years' War. Christine de Pizan herself celebrated Joan, extolling not just her virtue and accomplishments, but also her status as an instrument of God's divine will. As she writes, quote, "What honor for the female sex! God's love for it appears quite clear. Because the kingdom laid to waste by all those wretched people now stands safe, a woman rescued it. 100,000 men could not do that, and killed the hostile foe. She's captain over all. Such strength no Hector or Achilles had. All this God does, who's guiding her." End quote. In short, she and many others were captivated by the example of a young woman not only challenging the expectations of what women were suited to, but doing so with the backing of God, emulating Old Testament heroines like Deborah and Judith. What about the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment? These periods, heralded for their free-thinking spirit, might seem like they would challenge traditional gender roles. Surprisingly, however, they often reinforced them. 18th century scientists, for example, used skeletal anatomy to argue that women's larger pelvis meant that they were predestined by nature for domesticity and childbearing, while men's larger skulls supposedly proved their intellectual superiority. At the same time, women lost significant influence in areas they had previously dominated, particularly in midwifery, due to arguments that modern scientific methods and instruments were superior to the primitive traditional methods of untrained women. Wherever fields were professionalized, women were typically driven out. Enlightenment thinkers weren't immune to these views either. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his Émilie, argued that women were naturally suited for domestic roles and should be educated to fulfill them, emphasizing obedience and nurturing. While this position wasn't especially controversial to his contemporaries, future readers nevertheless deemed it to be deeply hypocritical, given he argued in the very same work that men's education should teach them to overcome social conventions and embrace individuality. Even the revolutionary period saw setbacks. While revolutionary liberals aimed to dismantle artificial hierarchical distinctions based on birth, class, and privilege, women were often excluded from considerations about equality. Both the revolutionary French and imperial Napoleonic regimes legally codified traditional gender norms, sometimes restricting women's rights even further. Under Napoleon, for example, women were legally subordinated to their husbands, losing control over property, finances, and personal decisions. Despite their key role in the revolution, such as leading the march to bring the royal family back to Paris, women were systematically excluded from political life. The Paris Commune even outlawed women's clubs and forbade women from attending their meetings, with one member remarking, "It is horrible. It is contrary to all laws of nature for a woman to want to make herself a man. The council must recall that some time ago these denatured women, these viragos, wandered through the markets with the red cap to sully that badge of liberty, and wanted to force all women to take off the modest headdress that is appropriate for them. Is it the place of women to propose motions? Is it the place of women to place themselves at the head of our armies?" Given that the French Revolution actively sought to de-Christianize France in the name of deconstructing traditional hierarchies and promoting equality, the historical reality of Joan of Arc, a French Christian, successfully leading the French army, gives his statement a dark and bitter irony. Nevertheless, as mentioned before, this period was not without its advocates for gender equality. Some Enlightenment thinkers like Diderot and Voltaire argued for the intellectual equality of men and women. However, it was female thinkers who most powerfully advanced the conversation on women's rights. Mary Estelle, in a serious proposal to the ladies, called for better education for women, and in some reflections upon marriage, she questioned unequal power dynamics within marriage, asking, if all men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves? The strongest 18th century statement for women's rights came from Mary Wollstonecraft, often considered the founder of modern European feminism. In Vindication of the Rights of Women, Wollstonecraft criticized thinkers like Rousseau for hypocritically advocating women's subjection while opposing arbitrary powers in other areas like monarchy and slavery. She argued that, since reason is innate to all humans regardless of sex, women should have equal rights in education, economics, and politics. Similarly, Olympe de Gouges championed women's equality in her Declaration on the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, asserting that women should have equal rights to property, liberty, and participation in public life. Both Wollstonecraft and de Gouges called for women's autonomy in both private and public spheres, free from institutionally imposed male dominance. Here we reach a notable turning point in history. Not only does feminist discourse become increasingly more influential and prominent from this point forth, but gender roles increasingly become determined less by abstract philosophical discourse and more by concrete socioeconomic phenomena. The Industrial Revolution's impact on family life and gender roles cannot be understated. Remember earlier in the video when I asked you to keep in mind your perception of traditional gender roles? Let's revisit that. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, there was broad consensus that women should be confined to the domestic sphere, focused primarily on family and childbearing. However, to contemporary ears, the phrase domestic sphere carries much heavier implications than its historical usage. While we often associate domesticity today with staying home and not working, that wasn't the case for most of history. Before industrialization, family life and work were closely intertwined. In traditional economies built on agricultural work and cottage industries, every member of the family contributed to economic production. With the rise of factory work and wage labor, however, a rigid distinction between home life and work life was created for the first time in history. We can see then the root of future expectations that women be shut out of economic production, while men assume the role of the sole income earner, an expectation that marked a sharp departure from the past. Yet even during the Industrial Revolution, this shift was gradual. Initially, factories in the United States preferred to employ entire families or young unmarried women, such as in the Lowell system. It was only when labor conditions worsened that women, particularly from wealthier and middle-class families, were replaced by men, reinforcing the gender divide between the workplace and home. Since low-income women nevertheless remained at work under dangerous conditions as a matter of economic necessity, a stay-at-home lifestyle for middle-class and wealthy women eventually became a symbol of wealth, status, and privilege. How did upper-class women react to their newfound isolation from the workforce? They established a female-dominated culture called the cult of domesticity, a space where women could bond over female-specific interests while also educating children and promoting family virtue. The cult of domesticity became so influential that it reversed the historical view of women as morally weaker than men. In fact, during the Victorian era, women were now seen as morally superior guardians of virtue, leading moral reform movements like abolition and temperance. This belief in women's moral superiority became a key argument for women's suffrage. If women were the moral compass of society, then surely public policy would benefit from their influence and perspective. Yet even while this elevated status and public perception was empowering women, it nevertheless became yet another restrictive expectation that women felt compelled to live up to. What were feminists of this era fighting for beyond labor rights and suffrage? One major issue was the legal subjection of wives to their husbands within marriage. While unmarried women could theoretically own property and sign contracts in their own names, married women were generally denied these rights, leaving many women financially vulnerable, especially widows who depended on family generosity. Domestic abuse was also not treated as a crime in most states, leaving women vulnerable to violence with little legal recourse. Initially, feminist discourse focused on promoting equality within marriage, given the dire circumstances married women and widows faced. However, by the 20th century, some feminists began to question whether marriage itself should persist at all. Feminists critical of marriage argued that the institution inherently, as a matter of design, subjugated women as childbearers to men. While this radical view remained a minority position for some time, these sentiments nevertheless had a considerable impact on the development of second-wave feminism in the early 1900s. As late as the early 20th century, women were still taught that motherhood was the pinnacle of fulfillment. However, psychological studies in the 1920s, particularly by behaviorists like John B. Watson, challenged the idea that women were naturally suited to be ideal mothers without expert guidance. This prompted feminist calls for women to shun their traditional roles as mothers, to explore romance without the expectation of children. This led to the rise of the companionate marriage, where middle-class wives shared in their husbands' social lives, focused on personal appearance, and saw sexual relationships as an expression of love, not just procreation. Yet, this romantic ideal also pressured women to define their worth by their ability to please their husbands, dressing up and preparing dinner for her husband returning home from work. In response, feminists went a step farther, pushing for women to seek fulfillment outside of marriage or even independent of men entirely, advocating for careers in single life as equally or more rewarding paths. It was at this stage that feminism took yet another controversial turn. As feminists increasingly questioned whether women should find fulfillment as wives and mothers, leaders like Margaret Sanger, the eventual founder of Planned Parenthood, opposed measures traditionally championed by feminists, like the Shepard-Towner Act, a law that funded prenatal and child health care, on the grounds that it would hinder the birth control movement. Likewise, as many women grew increasingly frustrated with the rigid Victorian standards of female respectability, many feminists, influenced by Freudian ideas, argued for a radical change in feminine roles, seeking emotional and physical release from repression and inhibition. The rise of the flapper allowed women to embrace previously taboo behaviors like smoking, drinking, and wearing seductive clothing. While proponents argued such a change was necessary for the liberation of women from centuries of psychologically destructive expectations, opponents argued that it shifted feminism from a movement for social progress and advancement of virtue to one focused on individual gratification and nihilistic moral relativism, prioritizing personal freedom over the common good. And so we finally arrive at the 1950s, the era so often designated by both sides of popular discourse as the archetype of traditional gender norms. Just how traditional were the 1950s in reality? Well, it's true that the era marked a conservative backlash against earlier shifts in gender norms, partly due to the economic instability caused by women being introduced and removed from the workplace twice by the World Wars. It nevertheless was in most other respects revolutionary. The rise of the automobile in the 1920s, combined with the shift to suburban living in the 1950s, fragmented the extended family by creating an expectation that children would move far from their parents and establish nuclear households, wherein, almost as a matter of necessity, men would be sole wage earners while women would stay home to care for children who needed a guardian to be present when they came home from school. Furthermore, the child-center culture characteristic of the 1950s was driven by figures like Dr. Spock, who advocated for parenting focused on the child's needs over those of the parents. Mothers were expected to dedicate themselves to childcare, while fathers worked increasingly hard to meet the financial demands of a consumer-driven society. As noble as the intentions of this era were, the negative consequences of this unique social experiment became quickly apparent. A substantial mental health crisis amongst men and women alike emerged in the 1950s, marked by a significant increase in the prescription of tranquilizers, antidepressants, and sedatives, especially Miltown, to women to treat nervous tension and hysteria. While women's distress was largely medicalized, implying that her unhappiness was a consequence of a psychological or psychiatric disorder rather than discontent with her circumstances, men, meanwhile, were less likely to resort to medication due to stigma and were more likely to turn to alcohol. Young women growing up in this era were told they would live lives just like their mommies and daddies one day. How did those children, looking to their fathers and mothers as examples of what they could expect with the status quo, grow into adulthood? By leading the revolutionary movements of the 1960s. What are the perspectives of contemporary postmodern feminism? How did feminism evolve as it emerged from the 1950s? Jaded not just by the experience of women, but also the struggles of minority and the poor, feminism began embracing Marxism and intersectionality. While feminists were not a monolith, many began to call not only for reform of institutions, but for the revolutionary overthrow of institutions they saw as instruments of the male power structure. Men themselves would have to be reformed as well, since patriarchy was a product of enduring toxic masculinity. In line with social Marxist theories, men were identified collectively as an oppressor class benefiting from unfair privileges. Just as the proletariat were called to overthrow the bourgeoisie, so were women called to dismantle institutions of male dominance and lead the creation of a new egalitarian world order. This call for the oppressed to overthrow the oppressor was only strengthened by intersectional identity theory, which argued that discrimination cannot be understood in isolation because identities are interconnected. Since systems of oppression are interlocking and often mutually enforcing, instances of discrimination are systemic rather than merely personal, and are deeply embedded in social, economic, and political structures. The only solution for liberation is to dismantle the interconnected systems by seizing control of the institutions of power. The benevolence of individual members of the oppressor class would never be sufficient. And thus, we arrive back at the present day, collectively bearing the weight of past ideas and evolving conditions. Where do we stand now? Have we truly achieved the radical progress promised by our evolving understanding of gender, or are we witnessing the unraveling of an egalitarian vision that has left us questioning the cost of our transformation? On the one hand, undeniable progress has been made. We now recognize the intellectual and moral equality of women despite centuries of assertions to the contrary, and legal protections once unimaginable have been firmly established, from property and contract rights to labor rights, voting rights, and safeguards against domestic violence. Yet, despite these advancements, many gendered issues persist, deeply embedded at every level of society. And as society looks to postmodern feminism for answers, it remains unclear whether contemporary feminism knows the solution, or if we've simply exchanged one set of challenges for another by following its guide. How are women faring? Progressive standards have created a new set of demands on women, pushing them to do it all. The expectation to balance career, family, and personal fulfillment has led to burnout, mental strain, and identity confusion, all while many women increasingly feel men and society at large fail to recognize the increased effort they're contributing as a sex to family life. Women continue to handle the majority of domestic labor and emotional caregiving, all while working full-time jobs, leading to the emergence of the so-called second shift, wherein women are never given the opportunity to relax. Meanwhile, Even though the sexual revolution promised freedom and personal autonomy, in practice, its idealistic expectations left many women disillusioned with relationships and family life entirely, questioning whether loneliness would be preferable to surrendering one's bodily autonomy to another, a choice more consequential for females who, unlike males, face the prospect of pregnancy. Like many other social movements, feminism has been seized by corporate interests to become yet another consumer product, paradoxically championing the concept of choice while selling increasingly narrow visions of empowerment that demand a hyper-competitive career, sexual liberation, and progressive political activism. Women who don't wish to conform to these new progressive expectations are often looked down upon as slowing the progress of the entire female sex. In the end, women are left struggling to live up to an ideal that demands they excel in all areas, but offers little concrete institutional support in return. What about men? Globalization, automation, and deindustrialization have left many men grappling with economic instability and a sense of disempowerment. Historically, blue-collar work provided men with a clear identity and purpose. But as manufacturing jobs have disappeared, men face an uncertain future with no clear path to reclaim what they've lost. Compounding the crisis, corporate America and the media send mixed messages. Men are told to be financially successful like in generations past, while simultaneously being mocked in their capacity as fathers, portrayed as unnecessary idiots who need to be restrained by their more intelligent, socially conscious, and emotionally aware wives. Meanwhile, men are exposed to rhetoric that deems masculinity itself toxic and oppressive, forcing them to reconcile outdated expectations with accusations of villainy. This contradiction has left men feeling betrayed and disillusioned, trapped in a cycle of judgment and alienation that fuels rising rates of depression, substance abuse, and violence. There's a growing yearning for the past when men had clear roles that were respected for fulfilling, but this nostalgia is increasingly at odds with the reality, not just of shifting gender power dynamics, but also an economy that no longer supports the lifestyles and aspirations their parents once had. Women now outpace men in education, employment, and social influence, particularly in fields like medicine, law, and business. In a world that rewards traits like communication and multitasking, qualities historically linked to femininity, men find themselves struggling to maintain relevance in a society that increasingly views them as obstacles to progress. This disconnect between societal expectations and personal fulfillment has created a widespread emotional turmoil. As masculinity is redefined, many men feel lost, directionless, and emasculated, especially when their past virtues are demonized, while the new ideal of masculinity often requires traits historically associated with femininity. Traits that men are told to adopt, but without sufficient guidance on how to do so without appearing pathetic to women. This has led to a rise in opting out of traditional milestones like marriage, fatherhood, and career paths, as men feel they are unfairly disadvantaged and undervalued. The current legal system, still skewed towards women in divorce and custody cases, adds to men's feelings of financial and emotional disadvantage. As a result, men are withdrawing from relationships, unable to see the rewards of investing in family life, and are facing the challenges of modern masculinity in isolation. As such, they've become increasingly attracted to extreme rhetoric that preys upon their insecurities and encourages them to embrace the self-serving aspects of historical views on masculinity, dominance, hedonism, aggression, emotional detachment, while rejecting the more noble aspects, leadership, self-control, self-sacrifice, and moral witness, on the grounds that a society that no longer appreciates their contributions no longer deserves them. What are we to make of all of this? Does postmodern feminism have the answers? Well, as mentioned before, postmodern feminism is heavily influenced by social Marxism and intersectional identity theory. To be sure, there are some merits to the critiques expressed by these schools of thought. Marxism, for example, rightly highlights that inequality stems from systems and institutions, not just individual attitudes. Intersectional theory, similarly, emphasizes how systems of oppression are interconnected, revealing that those in marginalized groups can still perpetuate harm. Exemplified by Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood, who infamously advocated for birth control to create a, quote, cleaner race, and weed, quote, out the unfit, a view of hers that resurfaced during the racial protests of 2020. However, might these influences have led to some unforeseen consequences, causing feminism to turn away from its original goals? Modern approaches to gender often place men and women into narrow, predefined roles, emphasizing their differences rather than their shared humanity. A stark irony, given the historical injustices that gave rise to feminism. This has fragmented society, pushing people to identify first as members of opposing identity groups rather than fellow citizens or human beings. Consequently, challenges shared in common between men and women like economic insecurity, mental health, and the need for genuine connection are overlooked. Rigid ideological frameworks oversimplify the complexities of gender, reducing men to a one-dimensional narrative of oppression. While accountability for harmful behaviors and attention to systemic inequalities are essential, a more nuanced understanding is needed, one that recognizes both men and women as multifaceted individuals, with strengths and struggles that transcend stereotypes. True gender equality should not pit men and women against each other, but recognize their shared humanity, celebrating their unique qualities and working together for a more just society. What began as a movement to liberate women from societal expectations has created new, contradictory pressures on both sexes, but especially men. Third-wave feminism, rather than fostering mutual respect and equality, risks replacing one form of oppression with another. By labeling masculinity itself as inherently toxic, it denies men the autonomy to define themselves beyond rigid cultural narratives or deterministic biological assumptions. Men are caught in a double bind. They're expected to embody traditional masculine traits like strength and assertiveness to support women, yet these traits are often condemned as oppressive. Meanwhile, men who embrace emotional vulnerability or traditionally feminine activities are criticized as emasculated or simping. These contradictory messages leave men confused about how to engage authentically in relationships without facing judgment. Rather than uniting as complementary partners, both sexes are increasingly divided by ideological lines, reinforcing distrust, miscommunication, and missed opportunities for genuine connection. Here, I suspect that some viewers may be concerned that I'm potentially overstating the degree to which masculinity is degraded in public discourse. Given the strength of the language I've used, I certainly understand that suspicion. That said, to illustrate that what I've described so far is unfortunately not mere exaggeration, I've linked in the description of this video an article from the American Psychiatric Association. Within the article, titled, APA Issues First Ever Guidelines for Practice with Men and Boys, the APA states that their guidelines, the existence of which they feel the need to justify, are necessary because men are in turmoil. Their first cited statistic is that men are disproportionately perpetrators of homicide, only after mentioning that men are also disproportionately victims. The APA states outright that traditional masculinity is psychologically harmful, and then, without nuancing at all, claims that, quote, the more men conform to masculine norms, the more likely they were to consider as normal risky health behaviors, end quote. While they do, to their credit, state at the end of the article that, quote, it's also important to encourage pro-social aspects of masculinity, end quote, they nevertheless characterize those elements as only, quote, potentially positive, end quote, while ensuring everybody knows that, quote, about a third of the traits that people consider to be positive aspects of masculinity, such as sacrificing for others and having strong morals, are actually expected more from women than men, end quote. What are men to conclude from this, other than that masculinity itself is inherently destructive? Is the takeaway that to be a socially improved, psychologically balanced person, men must reject traditional masculinity and adopt traits more associated with femininity? For centuries, women were told that they had to reject their femininity and embrace masculine characteristics to succeed. If that wasn't a good solution for women, why do we think that imposing the reverse on men will lead to better outcomes? Remember towards the start of the video when I asked you to keep in mind Simone de Beauvoir's argument that masculinity has historically been defined as the normative expression of human nature, while women were defined in relation to men, specifically by how they serve the interests of men? Today, we hear from feminists that the future is female, and that the future of masculinity is embodied by competent and respectful men standing on the sidelines to cheerlead for powerful women. According to the Guardian article, God knows we need an antidote for all the lousy men in the news, and I think I've found one. The writer Emma Brox writes that Doug Emhoff, Kamala Harris's husband, is an antidote to lousy men everywhere, a wife guy, who, despite his many personal accomplishments, is seemingly completely happy to promote, support, and cheerlead his high-profile wife. Similarly, Belinda Luscombe writes for AOL that you don't have to be the quarterback to play the game. Not unlike good husbands, men like Emhoff will appear when they're needed. The USA Today article, Football Coach and Cheerleader, How Tim Walz is Defining Masculinity in 2024, quotes the sexism researcher Amy Deal as stating, "He shows you can be masculine but also not threatened by women as equals, or women who are in positions of power. In fact, you can cheerlead for them." Finally, in Los Angeles Loyolan, Sam Barry describes Walz's role in the 2024 election as embodying a progressive, compassion-based form of masculinity, wherein Walz embraces his leadership role in a positive masculine way by simply being on the ticket with a woman and taking a backseat to his running mate. If the future is female, and men are told to embrace a more feminine role, while defining their masculinity by their capacity to cheerlead for women, are we not simply reversing de Beauvoir's critique, establishing femininity as the normative expression of human nature and defining men not by their own virtues but in relation to women? At the very least, it's clear that the imagery coming from modern feminism isn't one in which men and women act as equal co-creators of society, but one in which men hand over the torch of power and embrace cheerleading in a society where women lead. So, if contemporary feminism isn't the answer, what is? Can we simply look back to the past? That's not the answer either, because every era, no matter how right it got some things, also had its own flaws. The ancient Greeks, however legitimate one may hold their metaphysical system to be, applied their system inaccurately to men and women because of scientifically inaccurate understandings about the mechanics of procreation. The ancient Romans based masculinity around warmongering domination, and humiliated their opponents through emasculation. The medieval Christians, despite their legitimate metaphysical advancements on the topic of sex and their belief in spiritual equality, nevertheless inherited ancient condescending beliefs about women. Early modern writers like Christine de Pizan, despite their good intentions and compelling metaphysical arguments, nevertheless resorted to citing legends like the tales of the Amazonians as concrete history to make their points. The scientific revolution and Age of Enlightenment saw the rise of appeals to biological determinism that would later form the foundation of eugenics. The Revolutionary era sought to dismantle traditional institutions like the Catholic Church in the name of equality, yet it often made conditions for women even harder. The Industrial Revolution economically disempowered men and women alike, but especially impacted women by eventually driving them from the workforce into the cult of domesticity. The Victorian and Progressive era placed intense expectations upon women to be morally superior to men, not only burdening women with incredible pressure, but also reversing, rather than eliminating, assumptions about the moral superiority of a particular sex. The early 20th century, influenced by Freudian theories about sexual liberation, largely rejected by most psychologists and mental health experts today, sparked the beginning of a society-wide rejection of family life, a requirement for the continued proliferation of the human race, even to the point that prominent feminists opposed legislation that would have made childcare more affordable for low-income women. The 1950s tried to create an illusory return to normalcy, while engaging in a failed revolutionary social experiment that placed incredible financial burdens on men, which future generations would be unable to keep up with, and intense restrictions on women, resulting in a widespread mental health crisis. And the contemporary era has pitted men and women against each other, growing the gender divide that early 20th century Westerns hoped would one day be closed. One thing is clear: we can neither adopt the extremes of radical feminism nor the failed experiments of the 1950s so-called traditional gender roles. A reactionary return to 1950s-style gender roles would not be a return to traditional values, but rather a reversion to a historically specific and revolutionary moment that cannot be replicated today. For those who do believe that tradition holds the answer, a more holistic view of tradition should question what truly promoted human flourishing throughout all civilizations and across time, rather than universalizing the subjective cultural constructs of a specific time with its specific economic and social conditions. What then can we learn from what was good and true in the past? Well, despite his reliance on inaccurate Greek assumptions to shape his view of gender roles, I do think that Aquinas got many things right about the metaphysics of sex more generally. Men and women are equally human, and neither masculinity nor femininity are the normative expressions of human nature. Rather, masculinity and femininity are both unique expressions of our one common shared humanity. There are no masculine or feminine virtues, but rather common human virtues that are expressed in uniquely masculine and feminine ways. Masculinity and femininity naturally complement rather than compete with each other, and it's a deformation of society when the sexes are made to compete antagonistically rather than supporting each other. Building upon that foundation, I think we can also learn from Christine de Pizan, who asserted that the metaphysical equality of men and women means that they are equal in terms of moral and intellectual potential, and should be granted equal access to personal formation through equal access to education. I think we should challenge contemporary notions of traditional gender roles by critically examining the impact of the Industrial Revolution upon family life, recognizing that shutting women out of economic life was not the norm for the vast majority of human history, and as such, it should not be the norm today, nor should legal norms restrict women from equality of opportunity. For those who are predisposed to champion family values, we should recognize that the stereotype of a housewife dolling up in a dress and makeup to greet her husband with dinner wasn't something that emerged from the pro-children 1950s, but rather pro-contraceptive propaganda from the 1920s, which neither family advocates nor progressive women ended up liking. For those whose first concern is who will care for children if both parents are at work, we should recall that before the invention of the automobile, most households were based on the extended rather than the nuclear family model, allowing grandparents to assist in childcare. Even if modern socioeconomic conditions no longer make that feasible, we should address that reality not by trying to force one sex back into the home, but rather by investing as a society in universal childcare and parental leave. In short, what we need is a vision where men and women are free to define themselves based on their unique humanity, not rigid social expectations. Rather than fighting for control, both genders should co-create a society based on mutual respect, where neither is defined by how they can serve the interests of the other. Only then can we move beyond toxic masculinity and restrictive femininity to build a more just, cooperative world. While differences between men and women do exist, they are less significant than what we share in common. We must avoid extremes, neither erasing gendered expressions of culture nor imposing rigid roles that box people into stereotypes. While cultural expressions of masculinity and femininity are valuable for helping men and women understand who they respectively are, which is important for embracing and celebrating the unique contributions of both sexes, they should never be over-universalized to impose subjective cultural standards as criteria of personal moral judgment. People should be free to explore and express their identities via morally neutral interests, without being castigated on the basis of stereotypes. A man who likes pink is no less a man, and a woman who loves skateboarding is no less a woman. They are both individuals who enjoy things that make them unique, and that uniqueness should be celebrated, not stifled. By embracing the diversity of human expression, and by embracing a diversity of healthy models to express both masculinity and femininity, we can build a society that values individuals for their humanity first. Only then will we see a world where men and women can both be proud of their unique characteristics, while working together side by side to create a better future for everyone. What do you think? Can we construct narratives about gender roles moving forward for the improvement of both women and men alike? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when new videos are released. Also be sure to like this video so that YouTube recommends it to others. If you'd like to support this channel for as little as $1 a month, you can also become a supporter on Patreon. Links in the description of this video. I look forward to the philosophical journey ahead with you. Peace be with you. This has been The Philosopher.